Gotcha.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another Monster Hunter World weapon guide. Today we're going to be doing something a little differently. We're going to be taking a look at the Lance weapon class. Particularly, we're going to be looking at the Taroth Crest Claw. This is a Rarity 7 reward from Kulve Taroth, so if you haven't fought her, go fight her. There's just so many good weapons that she drops, right? Now, this weapon's really an interesting weapon. It's clearly an elementalist weapon, because you can unlock its fire element, but it only gives you 90 more fire damage, so it's clearly meant for you to add the elementalist decoration. Let's go ahead and jump right into its attributes so we can make better sense of the weapon. So I believe its starting attack value is something like 430, but I went ahead and added the elementalist decoration because no reasonable build would skip the elementalist decoration, and I've already got one attack augmentation on my lance, my Taroth Crest Claw, so my attack value is 492 after that. The sharpness, we're going to build that up a little bit. What I like to do when it comes to handicraft, I like to have that be my charm, because for whatever reason, when you're building handicraft, it's really interesting. Handicraft is a rank 3 skill, and you get to bring it up 3 levels, right, with the charm. Then you've got other skills like weakness, exploit, or maximum might, and when you're building charms for those, it only lets you build it up by 2. And some of them, you only get to build it up by 1, like a critical boost. You only get 1 skill point when you're building that charm. So for whatever reason, the handicraft charm is really good. So when I'm picking my build out, if I'm going to build handicraft, I typically make it the charm, right? So, another thing you'll notice about Taroth Crest Claw is it has a pretty high affinity rating of 30%, and this is going to be central to how we're going to be selecting the build. So why don't we go ahead and jump over to the build. I think we've already covered most of its attributes. I mean, we could talk about the augmentation. I recommend taking at least 1 health boost augmentation. You could then take an affinity augmentation, which I'll explain why you might consider doing that in a second. But I just go with attack because attack's always the hardest thing to build in my opinion, and that's why I think that is so valuable. Alright, we're jumping over to the build. I'm going to start explaining the choices I made and prioritizing skills for you. So right off the bat, there's a few things you'll notice. I have the non-elemental boost. If you don't have this skill, I'm not sure I would use this weapon. You're just losing so much damage if you don't have that skill. Next, you'll notice I take handicraft up to 3. I just explained that I put that as a charm because you get 3 ranks of it. Okay, so now I have the white sharpness bar. And then I would say the next most important skill on the build is weakness exploit. Weakness exploit, every time you hit a crit spot on the monster, you're going to get 50% more affinity, right? And that's going to be on top of the 30% that already exists. So you're going to get 80% affinity at that point. Then after that, I would say the attack boost, which not only increases your damage per hit, but also gives you 5% more affinity as long as you took it to rank 4. So now you have about 85% affinity every time you strike a monster on one of their weak spots. And then the last important skill is definitely Master's Touch. You get this by putting together 3 parts of the Teostra armor set. Basically what Master's Touch does is when you land a critical hit, you do not lose sharpness on your weapon. This is really valuable because if you didn't know this about lances, they lose sharpness really quickly. Lances do, right? So typically when people are trying to build for a lance, they're trying to figure out, do I bring speed sharpening? By the way, you can always use wetfish scales. Wetfish scales, you have to fish for them, and then they're like they're much faster than the whetstone. I believe they only take 2 strikes, and your weapon will be sharp, right? So wetfish scales, those are useful, but in general, again, perfect polish, speed sharpening, maxing out your handicraft. Players who are using lances are looking at those options because lances just become dull so quickly. Well, because of the high affinity on this lance, and because you can add the 5% affinity from attack boost and the 50% affinity from weakness exploit, you're able to get away with using Master's Touch. And so even though the Teostra set isn't the most efficient armor set anymore, it actually is pretty efficient here because it just synergizes with the attributes of the Taroth Crest Claw so well. So most of the skills on the build really are already high priority, right? Weakness exploit with the 30% affinity, with the 5% from attack boost, with the handicraft, with Master's Touch, right? They all work together. Really the only room I had for wiggling around was definitely I could have chosen to go with something other than 2 crit jewels, right? Crit boost to level 2. I actually would have preferred critical boost to level 3. I just couldn't fit it on the build in any way. And then with the leggings, I could have actually gone with the Lunastra leggings, and I would have had Well, basically, I would have given up 2 levels of wide range and 1 level of peak performance in order to have 2 levels of health boost. You could still do that if you wanted to. I just didn't feel it was necessary. I already feel pretty safe because I have a shield. So I bring the wide range for my teammates and the peak performance. Every now and then the peak performance gives me a little more damage, right? So that's why I ended up with the Kulve Taroth Wrath leggings. And that's basically it. You will go into your fight, and you're going to be careful not to attack a monster on an armored part of their body, right? That's where you'll get deflected. You're also going to be careful to focus on hitting the weak spots of the monster's body so that the Master's Touch will kick in, because you're probably going to get a crit hit on that monster, right? And if you're doing it right, you won't have to resharpen your Taroth Crest Claw even one time for the whole fight, right? And again, for the augmentations, I recommend taking 1 heal augmentation, and then your choice between attack or affinity. Affinity is going to keep your sharpness up more often because you're going to get just, 10% more crits. Attack will just raise your damage output, and that's up to you to decide. I found that I didn't need the extra affinity. I found that my sharpness was lasting long enough without it, but you may feel differently about that. For tips on playing with the Lance, Lance is an interesting weapon. It's got a running attack, right? A charge, where you can actually jump, and that counts as mounting damage. So you can actually mount a monster pretty easily if you really wanted to. It doesn't do a lot of damage. I actually used the charge to just reposition myself while turning that into a strong attack. There's just a few things you really have to understand about the Lance. The first thing is, since you do not move very quickly with the Lance, you rely very heavily on your hops. After you've used an attack, you can hop. If you push the joystick in a direction, it's a large hop, right? It'll do a big hop. Another thing is, after 3 strikes with the Lance, you'll want to hop 1 time, and that'll allow you to go into another pattern of 3 strikes with the Lance. If you don't, there'll be a big pause in between the 3 strikes, and this is a very inefficient pause. Well, I wouldn't call it really inefficient, but it is inefficient. Lance is a weapon with a lot of range. It's great for cutting the tails off of monsters, really for severing any part of a monster's body or breaking a part of a monster's body, in my experience. And the biggest problem I ever have with the Lance is dealing enough damage. I feel like if you want to deal great damage with the Lance, no matter what, you have to be good enough to avoid being staggered, knocked over, and damaged. You have to be really good at not just guarding their moves, but knowing when you can use a counterattack and using the power guard to move into a strong counterattack as well. Like, the power guard can turn into a charge, the power guard can turn into a jump as well. So you also have this advancing jump that's really rare. Well, I wouldn't call it really rare, but it's very specific to the Lance, where you can jump forward and you can turn that into an attack. And what's interesting about that advancing jump is you can guard while you're using it. So the Lance is surprisingly mobile for a weapon that walks really slow, right? It is surprisingly mobile. What the Lance really actually does bad is, again, you have to be very vigilant to get all of the damage output that you can possibly get out. It takes a lot of focus in order to do that. And the other one is, it's got a very slow sheath speed. So anytime you know you're going to be in trouble and you need to sheath your weapon, you're already in a lot of trouble just because it's going to be risky to sheath it, right? So that's kind of how it is. That's how it is when you're playing a Lance. The shield doesn't protect your back, so if something like Basil Guse drops a bomb in front of you and behind you, you're trapped, you're in trouble. So just little things like that. And if you've never used the Lance, I highly recommend giving it a try. It's certainly a lot of fun to use. One of the things I've always found interesting about the Lance is that, for whatever reason, they designed it so that your right arm holds the shield and your left arm holds the Lance. That's just a cosmetic thing I noticed, but it's such, I don't know, so strange. Maybe the person who worked on this weapon was left-handed, right? So it's just a small note, but yeah, overall, I've always found that the Lance is a very, what's the word? A very orderly weapon. It feels very ordered. If you're the kind of person who has a very conservative mindset when you're playing, it's very hard to lose when you're using the Lance. If you're just into wild slashes, and that's not bad with the Lance. Technically, when you're in that good flow and you're poking the monster and over and over again, kind of does feel like a wild slash. But the truth is, a very good Lance player is thinking defensively constantly with their ability to block, and also especially their ability to counterattack. Right? You're preparing to react to whatever it is the monster's going to do, not with the roll, but with the guard. All right, and I said all that just because this is my first Lance video, my first weapon guide for the Lances, so I thought I'd talk a little bit more about my experiences with the weapon and what you probably should be focusing on. With all of that being said, I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.